Zera had always been the jewel of her family, the kind of rare being that could make an entire planet stand still with a glance. She wasn't just beautiful. She had abilities others could only dream of. Born with the power to manipulate energy, her species revered her as a living weapon. However, despite her extraordinary gifts, Zera's life had been anything but kind. Her mother, the queen of their world, had passed away when she was young. That loss was something she never truly got over, but it was her stepmother who would ultimately shape the darkest chapter of her life. Zera's stepmother was a ruthless woman, someone who sought everything as a tool to gain more power. She had never cared for Zera the way a mother should. To her, Zera was a means to an end, a pawn in the bigger game of politics and wealth. And when Zera's abilities caught the attention of the highest bidders in the galaxy, her stepmother didn't hesitate for a second. She sold her own stepdaughter into slavery to a cruel alien lord, seeking to gain favor with the richest and most powerful in the galaxy. Zera's heart shattered in that moment as she realized the depth of the betrayal. The woman who had raised her as a child was now treating her as nothing more than an object to be sold off for money and power. It was a cold, sharp pain that Zera could hardly understand. The auction took place on a massive, bustling space station, a place where the desperate and the broken went to be bought and sold. Zera stood in a cold, metal cage, shackled and vulnerable, surrounded by dozens of other slaves. Her stepmother stood nearby, chatting with various traders and wealthy buyers, her expression cold and calculating. Zera couldn't even look at her. The words she had said to her stepmother echoed in her mind. "You promised you'd never let anything happen to me." But the promise had been broken, shattered, the moment her stepmother had signed away her freedom. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. The crowd in the auction hall was loud, chaotic, filled with aliens of all kinds, their eyes gleaming with greed as they bid for Zera's life. She could hear the voices shouting bids, some offering riches, others offering cruelty. Her shackles rattled as she shifted in place, trying to ignore the sensation of fear creeping up her spine. The auctioneer's voice was like a thunderclap, announcing each bid with growing excitement. A rare, powerful slave. Only the best buyers can handle her. He boomed, and the crowd cheered as the price climbed higher and higher. Zera felt sick. She wasn't a slave. She wasn't a thing to be sold. But in that moment, it didn't matter. And then, the worst happened. Her stepmother stepped forward, smiling as the final deal was struck. Zera was sold. Her life, her future, was no longer hers to control. As the transaction was completed, Zera's stepmother turned her back without a second glance. The hurt was so intense that it almost felt like physical pain. "You'll never be free again," Zera whispered under her breath, watching her stepmother walk away, as if Zera was nothing more than a mistake she had no use for anymore. Just as Zera was being led away from the auction, she caught a glimpse of something in the crowd, a human figure. At first, she thought she was imagining things. Humans were rare in this part of the galaxy, but there he was, standing near the back of the room, eyes fixed on her. His presence wasn't commanding, but there was something about him that stood out. He seemed to be watching the auction intently, not like the others who were there to purchase. Zera's heart raced, and she couldn't explain why. She was pulled away from the scene before she could think much more about it. Her new owner, an alien lord known for his cruelty, was already making arrangements to take her aboard his private ship. The feeling of dread tightened in Zera's chest as she was led away from the space station, the massive door to the ship closing behind her with a heavy thud. The ship was cold and dark. The walls seemed to close in on Zera, as if they were alive, watching her, trapping her in a nightmare that she couldn't escape. The crew was made up of cruel beings who seemed to delight in her discomfort. They didn't speak much to her, but their eyes were always on her, as if she was just an object to be used. Zera was locked in a small cell on the lower deck, her heart heavy with the weight of the reality she now faced. She was a prisoner, not just of her captors, but of her circumstances. The thought of never seeing the stars of her homeworld again, of never feeling freedom, sent waves of despair crashing over her. Just as Zira was about to give in to hopelessness, the ship suddenly jolted. She heard distant explosions, the sound of laser fire, and a series of alarms blaring through the ship's intercom system. A moment later, the ship's control room was in chaos as the ship's captain barked orders, and Zira's cage door opened. Before she could even react, a man stepped into her cell. He was human, tall and strong, with a look of determination in his eyes. The soldier's eyes met hers, and for the first time since her stepmother's betrayal, Zira felt a spark of something. Hope. She was no longer alone. Without a word, the human soldier moved toward her, quickly cutting the locks on her shackles. "You're coming with me," he said in a calm but firm voice. Now, Zira didn't fully understand what was happening, but the urgency in his tone told her she had no choice. She followed him without hesitation, unsure of where she was going but knowing that this might be her only chance. As they made their way through the ship, Zira's heart pounded. Could this human really help her? Or was this just another part of her nightmare? But in that moment, as they neared the ship's exit, Zira realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, she would escape. She wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time since her stepmother's betrayal, Zira felt a flicker of hope in her heart. Zira's mind was racing as she followed the human soldier through the dark, cold halls of the alien ship. Her heart still thudded loudly in her chest, the sound echoing in her ears. She had never imagined that anyone would come to her rescue, especially not a human. Humans were a rarity in these parts of the galaxy, known for their toughness, but rarely seen in the kinds of places where Zira had lived. The fact that this soldier was here, now, made no sense. The soldier led her through the narrow corridors with swift, deliberate steps. His movements were calm, controlled, someone used to danger. The sharp, harsh sound of alarms blaring throughout the ship didn't seem to faze him. He walked with purpose, his eyes scanning every corner, his gun at the ready. Zira, on the other hand, could hardly focus on anything except her own confusion and fear. How had this human gotten onto the ship? What did he want with her? Was he here to sell her to another master, or was he part of some larger rescue operation? She was too frightened to ask questions, but she couldn't help but stare at him as they moved quickly. His uniform was different from what Zira was used to seeing. It was sleek and tactical, designed for stealth and combat, clearly made for someone who worked in the shadows. His face, though, was what caught Zira's attention the most. There was something about him. His eyes were calm, but there was a quiet intensity there, a seriousness that told Zira he wasn't here by accident. His expression seemed both distant and focused, as if he had seen too much to be fazed by anything anymore. Zira's mind raced, trying to figure out who he was. A soldier, a mercenary, or perhaps part of some rebellion. She could only guess, but whatever he was, he had come for her. For reasons she didn't understand, he had decided to help her. And in that moment, as they rushed through the halls, she realized just how much she needed his help. They reached a narrow door at the end of a hallway, and the soldier quickly pressed a button, unlocking it. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed, but no one seemed to be around. "This way," he whispered, motioning for Zira to follow. She hesitated for a moment, unsure, but then followed him into what appeared to be a storage room. It was dimly lit, filled with crates and supplies, but most importantly, it was empty of guards. Zira glanced back, her fear rising again, but the soldier was already securing the door. He turned to face her, his face unreadable. "Stay here," he said firmly. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the command. "I'm going to take care of the crew." Zira was still processing everything that was happening. The soldier had saved her from certain doom, but she had no idea what he was planning next. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just nodded silently. The soldier gave her one last look, then turned and left the room. Zira didn't know how long she stood there, waiting in the dark. Her mind kept racing, questions swirling in her head like a storm. Who was this soldier? What did he want from her? Was he truly trying to save her, or was there something else going on that she didn't understand? And yet, amidst all the uncertainty, a small spark of hope flickered within her. This soldier, this human, was the first person in a long time who hadn't treated her like a thing to be owned. Zira had lived her entire life in the shadow of others' greed and power. From her stepmother to the cruel alien traders who had sold her, she had known nothing but betrayal. But this human was different. He was here for a reason, and that reason wasn't just to use her for his own gain. She could feel it in the way he had spoken to her earlier, the way he looked at her. He saw her as something more than an object. For the first time in a long while, Zira felt like someone cared about her, and that was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't long before she heard the distant sounds of blaster fire, followed by the muffled shouts of the crew. The soldier was doing what he had promised, taking care of the guards. Zira's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what was going on outside the room, but she knew that if this soldier failed, she would be right back where she started. She couldn't go back to that life, back to being treated like a commodity. She wouldn't survive it. She pressed her ear to the door, listening to the sounds outside. There was a tense silence that seemed to stretch on forever, only to be broken by the sound of footsteps approaching. Zira's heart skipped a beat. Had the soldier been caught? Was someone coming to get her? To her surprise, the door slid open again, and the soldier stepped inside. His clothes were slightly disheveled, and there was a small cut on his cheek, but he didn't look like he had been through anything too serious. He gave her a brief nod, his expression as serious as ever. "We need to move. The ship's about to take off, and we don't have much time." Zira nodded quickly, her fear rising again. The soldier seemed unfazed, his focus solely on getting them out of there. He motioned for her to follow him, and without hesitation, she did. They moved swiftly through the halls, the soldier's eyes scanning every corner, checking for any signs of danger. Zira could feel the tension in the air as they passed the alien crew, now scattered and confused after the soldier's surprise attack. It was clear the soldier knew exactly what he was doing. He was trained for this kind of operation, and Zira couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at how effortlessly he handled himself. But despite his skill, the danger wasn't over. They still had to escape the ship, and that would be no easy task. As they made their way toward the exit, Zira's mind raced. She had no idea what the future held or what this soldier's true intentions were, but she knew one thing for certain. He was her only hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, Zira allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could escape this nightmare. Maybe, with the help of this human soldier, she could finally be free. The sound of blaster fire echoed in the halls as Zira and the soldiers sprinted through the ship. The alarms were blaring louder now, a constant reminder that time was running out. Zira's heart was racing, each beat thumping in her chest like a drum. She had never felt more alive and more terrified than she did right now. She was running for her freedom, but every step felt like she was running toward the unknown. The soldier, despite the chaos unfolding around them, moved with a calm that was almost unnerving. His every move was calculated, precise. Zira couldn't help but be amazed at how effortlessly he navigated the ship, guiding her through tight corridors and around the scattered alien crew members. It was clear that he had done this before. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a professional, trained for this kind of mission. But as they rounded another corner, they encountered more resistance. A group of alien guards appeared, blocking their path. The soldier immediately reacted, pulling Zira behind him and raising his weapon. Without hesitation, he fired a few quick shots, taking down the guards with impressive accuracy. Zira flinched at the loud blasts, but the soldier didn't flinch at all. His focus never wavered. "Stay behind me," the soldier said in a low voice, his eyes scanning the hallway for more threats. "We're almost there, just a little longer." Zira nodded, trying to steady her breath as they continued to move forward. The chaos outside the room was growing louder. More shots, more shouts. It felt like the entire ship was coming apart at the seams. Yet, despite the madness, Zara felt strangely calm. It was as though the soldiers' calmness had rubbed off on her. For the first time since she had been sold into slavery, Zara felt like she wasn't alone in the fight. The soldier had become her protector, her ally in a world where she had been betrayed by everyone else. As they moved deeper into the ship, Zara couldn't help but wonder about the soldier. Who was he? What did he want with her? She had so many questions, but now wasn't the time to ask. They had to focus on getting out of the ship alive. Zara nodded, her heart still racing, but filled with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know what the future held, but with the soldier by her side, she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer alone. The airlock doors slid open with a hiss, revealing the cold, empty space outside the ship. Zara's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer, her boots clanging softly against the metal floor. They were so close to escaping. She could almost taste the freedom, the endless possibilities that lay beyond this ship, this nightmare. But the soldier's sudden pause stopped her in her tracks. "Wait," he murmured, his voice low but urgent. Zara turned to look at him, confusion crossing her face. The soldier's eyes were narrowed, scanning the dimly lit corridor ahead. His hand tightened around his weapon, his posture tense. He was alert, like a wolf sensing danger in the shadows. Zara could feel the tension in the air, the weight of something looming, something dangerous. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She was trying to keep her fear in check, but it was hard when every moment felt like the calm before a storm. The soldier didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly moved to one side of the doorframe, taking cover behind a large crate that stood against the wall. Zara's instincts told her to follow, to stay close, but she couldn't help the feeling that something was wrong. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and just as she was about to ask again, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound grew louder, and her heart raced faster. Someone was coming. She didn't know how many, but the footfalls were unmistakably heavy, deliberate. The soldier's eyes met hers briefly, and in that look, she saw the silent communication between them. He was preparing for a fight. Zara's hands trembled as she looked around. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself. She was completely reliant on the soldier. The thought made her feel vulnerable, exposed, but there was no time to worry about that now. A figure appeared at the end of the hallway, its silhouette casting a long shadow against the walls. It was massive, towering over the soldier like a beast of war. Zara's eyes widened in fear as the figure stepped into the light. It was one of the alien commanders, the ones who had tortured her before. Only now, this one was armored in thick, intimidating battle gear, his eyes glowing with a cold, ruthless light. He was armed to the teeth, and from the way he walked, Zara knew he wasn't here for a casual chat. He was here to kill. The soldier raised his weapon without a second thought, his body shifting into a battle-ready stance. Zara instinctively took a step back, her pulse racing as the alien commander's gaze locked onto them. There was no fear in his eyes, just a cruel, unwavering confidence. He knew who the soldier was. He knew who Zara was, and he wasn't going to let either of them leave. "Well, well," the commander said, his voice deep and guttural, echoing in the quiet hallway. "I didn't expect a human to get this far. You've caused quite the disruption, soldier. But it ends here." The soldier didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His eyes were cold, calculating. "You're wrong," he replied, his voice steady, unwavering. "This isn't where it ends." Without another word, the soldier lunged forward, his weapon firing with deadly precision. The commander moved fast, but not fast enough. A shot grazed his shoulder, the armor sparking from the impact. Zara felt a strange rush of adrenaline, as the battle between them began. She wanted to run, to hide, but she couldn't leave the soldier. She couldn't abandon him when he had done so much for her. The commander grunted in pain but didn't slow down. He raised his own weapon, a large, menacing plasma rifle, and fired back at the soldier. The soldier dodged, narrowly avoiding the blast as he rolled behind cover. Zara's heart was in her throat, but she knew she had to stay out of the way. She had to trust the soldier, had to believe that he could defeat this enemy. The fight continued with brutal intensity. The alien commander was relentless, using his size and strength to his advantage. Every strike he made was powerful, but the soldier was quick, his movements fluid and precise. It was clear that the commander underestimated the soldier, but that mistake would cost him dearly. Zira watched in awe as the soldier maneuvered around the commander, using the environment to his advantage. He was faster, smarter, and more skilled. The commander, though larger and stronger, couldn't match the soldier's agility. The two clashed again and again, their weapons ringing out in a symphony of destruction. The walls shook with each explosion, and the air smelled of burning metal. In the middle of the chaos, Zira noticed something she hadn't before. The soldier wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting for something more. His every move was driven by a purpose, a determination that she couldn't fully understand. It wasn't just about saving himself or her. It was about something bigger, something that gave him strength beyond anything she had ever seen. She could hear his breathing, steady and controlled, even in the heat of battle. It was like he was in complete control of the situation, even when things seemed impossible. Zira realized, in that moment, that she wasn't just watching a soldier fight. She was watching a man who had been through countless battles, who had seen death and destruction, and yet was still fighting with everything he had. The commander, now visibly wounded from the soldier's relentless attacks, roared in fury. With a final, furious charge, he lunged at the soldier, his plasma rifle aimed at the soldier's chest. The soldier sidestepped just in time, grabbing the commander's arm and twisting it in a move that would have broken any lesser being's bone. But the commander was no ordinary alien. He was strong, and with a primal yell, he swung his fist toward the soldier's head. For a moment, it seemed like the soldier might be overwhelmed, but just as the commander's massive fist closed in, the soldier ducked and sprang into the air, landing behind the commander. In one smooth motion, he swung his weapon around and fired a single decisive shot into the commander's back. The alien commander let out a final scream of rage before collapsing to the ground. Zira stared in shock, her heart still racing from the intensity of the battle. The soldier stood over the commander's body, his chest heaving with exertion. Sweat dripped from his forehead, but there was no satisfaction in his eyes, no relief. He was already thinking ahead, his mind working faster than Zira could keep up. "We're not done yet," the soldier said, his voice grim. "There are more coming. We need to move." Zira didn't hesitate. She nodded and followed him, her fear momentarily forgotten in the rush of survival. She had seen the soldier fight with everything he had, and now she knew. He was her protector, her lifeline in this endless war. Whatever came next, she wasn't facing it alone. The ship's corridors were growing darker as they ran. Zira could feel the weight of every passing second, the walls around them closing in. Her heart raced, and the sweat on her brow was more than just from the heat of the battle. They had fought their way through so much, but there was no time to stop, no time to catch their breath. The soldier's pace never slowed, his determination pushing him forward, but Zira could feel the exhaustion creeping into her bones. The soldier glanced back at her, his expression hard to read. "We're close," he said, his voice steady despite the strain in his eyes. "Stay with me. We can make it." Zira nodded, though she wasn't sure how much more either of them could take. The ship was in chaos. Flashes of light and explosions could be heard in the distance. The alarms blared like a constant warning that time was running out. They needed to escape, and fast. As they rounded a corner, a new sound echoed down the hallway. a low, mechanical hum that sent a chill down Zera's spine. It wasn't just the sound of the ship's systems failing or the alarms. It was the sound of something much more dangerous, something alive. The soldier froze, his eyes scanning the hallway ahead. "This isn't good," he muttered under his breath. Zera felt a lump form in her throat. What was coming now? She had already seen so much horror. Could they survive whatever this new threat was? From around the corner came the massive form of a combat drone, an imposing machine designed to hunt and destroy anything in its path. Its sleek, armored frame reflected the dim lights, and its red eyes glowed with a deadly, mechanical intelligence. Zera could see the weapons mounted on its arms: blasters, missiles, and sharp blades ready to tear through anything that dared stand in its way. The soldier raised his weapon, aiming it at the drone. Zera's breath caught in her throat. They were out of time. They couldn't outrun it, and they couldn't hide. This was their last challenge, the final obstacle between them and their freedom. Without a word, the soldier fired. A quick burst of shots rang out, striking the drone's armor. But the drone didn't even flinch. Instead, it raised its massive cannon, aiming directly at them. Zera's heart pounded in her chest as she realized how hopeless their situation was. The soldier had done so much, fought so hard, but it seemed like it was all for nothing. "Get down," the soldier shouted, shoving Zera to the ground just as the drone fired. The blast missed them by inches, sending debris flying everywhere. Zera's ears rang with the sound of the explosion, and for a moment, everything around her was a blur of smoke and dust. She looked up to find the soldier already back on his feet, his face set in a grim expression. He wasn't done yet. He couldn't be. But Zera could see the toll it had taken on him. He was exhausted, injured, and out of options. This time, the soldier didn't fire back immediately. He looked at Zera, his eyes softer than they had been before. "You need to go," he said, his voice low and serious. "I can hold it off." Zera shook her head, disbelief and fear flooding her. "What are you talking about?" "No, we fight together. We'll make it out of here together." But the soldier only shook his head, his jaw clenched. "This is the only way. I can't let you die here. You need to survive." Zera's chest tightened. She couldn't believe what he was saying. He was giving up, but not for himself. It was for her to live. The drone's massive cannon charged up, ready to fire another blast. The soldier turned his back to Zera, his body braced for the oncoming attack. The soldier's sacrifice was clear in his actions. He was willing to die so that she could escape. "Don't do this," Zera shouted, running toward him, but the soldier stopped her with a single glance. "I'll buy you time," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of finality. "You need to get to the escape pod. Now." Zera's heart was breaking. She couldn't just leave him, not after everything they had been through. He had protected her, fought for her, and now he was asking her to leave him behind. But there was no time to argue. The drone fired. The blast hit the soldier square in the chest, sending him crashing into the wall. Zera screamed, rushing to his side, her mind blank with panic. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked for any sign of life. His breathing was shallow, his body battered and bloody from the blast. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking as she shook him, trying to rouse him. "Please, no." The soldier opened his eyes slowly, his gaze meeting hers for a brief moment. "Get to the pod," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You can still make it. I'm counting on you." Tears welled up in Zera's eyes, but she knew he was right. She had to leave. She had to survive. For him. For everything he had done for her. "I won't forget you," Zera promised, her voice full of emotion. She kissed his forehead softly, before standing up and running toward the escape pod. The ship was falling apart around them, and there was no time to waste. Zera didn't look back. She couldn't. Every step she took away from the soldier felt like a part of her was being torn away. But she knew she couldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. Reaching the escape pod, Zara hesitated for just a moment, looking back toward where the soldier had fallen. The drone was still there, searching for its next target. But there was nothing left for Zara to do. She had to leave. With one last look at the battlefield, she climbed into the escape pod, her heart heavy with loss. The pod's doors closed behind her, sealing her off from the chaos outside. The countdown began, and within moments, she was launched into the cold void of space. As the pod drifted away, Zara let out a shaky breath, her body trembling. She was free, but the cost was unbearable. She had escaped, yes, but she would never forget the soldier who had given everything for her. She would carry his memory with her, no matter where she went. The journey wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, Zara felt a spark of hope. She wasn't alone anymore, and she would make sure his sacrifice wasn't forgotten. The stars outside the escape pod seemed to stretch on forever, like a never-ending sea of lights. Zara sat in silence, her hands gripping the seat tightly as the pod drifted farther from the wreckage of the ship. She couldn't shake the image of the soldier's face, his last words echoing in her mind. "You need to survive." She had promised him she would, but now, in the cold void of space, it felt like that promise was a burden. The pod was small, a simple escape vessel meant for one person, and the journey ahead felt endless. It was a sharp contrast to the chaos she had just escaped. The alarms, the explosions, the gunfire, all of it was fading into the distance, but the weight of the soldier's sacrifice remained heavy on her heart. She was free, yes, but at what cost? Zara looked out of the small viewport, watching the stars twinkle like distant beacons, and yet she felt so alone. The soldier had given her everything, his strength, his courage, his life. And now she was left with nothing but the memory of him, and a ship that could only take her so far. The pod's automatic systems hummed softly, bringing her back to reality. She glanced at the small console in front of her, the blinking lights signaling that she was on the right course. The escape pod was heading toward a nearby planet, an uncharted world that might hold the freedom she desperately sought. But the thought of what awaited her there did little to comfort her. What was freedom without the soldier? Without the person who had fought so hard to protect her? Zara leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes. She didn't want to think about the pain, the loss. She needed to focus on surviving. She had promised. She had to live, for both of them. Her hands were still shaking from the fear, from the adrenaline, and from the grief of losing someone who had become so important to her in such a short time. But there was no time for weakness. Not now. The pod's communication system blinked to life, a soft voice cutting through the quiet. It was a distress signal from the planet ahead. Zara's eyes snapped open. A distress signal. She had no idea what kind of world she was headed to, but the idea that someone else might need help was a distraction, a small glimmer of purpose in the midst of everything. She quickly tapped the controls, pulling up the message. The transmission was faint, the voice crackling with static, but the words were clear enough. "If anyone can hear this, we need assistance. Our people are in danger. We're fighting to survive." Zara's heart skipped a beat, a fight for survival. She had just escaped one battle, but now, it seemed, she was being drawn into another. Could she really help these people? Could she risk everything once again? But what else could she do? She couldn't just sit in the pod and wait. She had to do something. Taking a deep breath, Zara set a course for the planet. The pod's engines roared to life, and she felt it jolt forward, carrying her toward the unknown. The thought of joining another fight made her uneasy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just meant to survive. She was meant to make a difference. She had seen the best of humanity in the soldier, and she had felt his strength in her own heart. Maybe it was time to honor that strength, to use it to help others who were struggling. As the pod entered the planet's atmosphere, Zara's mind raced. She didn't know what awaited her on the surface. All she had were the vague coordinates from the distress signal and a deep, unshakable feeling that she wasn't alone in this fight. The soldier's words kept ringing in her ears. You need to survive. And survive she would. The pod descended through the thick clouds, the landscape below gradually coming into focus. The planet was a mix of rugged terrain and dense forests, with jagged mountains rising up against the horizon. The place looked wild, untamed, and yet there was something beautiful about it. As the pod finally touched down with a soft thud, Zara's heart raced with anticipation. What would she find here? Who were these people, and what kind of danger were they facing? She opened the hatch, stepping out into the unfamiliar world. The air was cool, but fresh, nothing like the sterile atmosphere of the ship she had just left. For the first time in what felt like forever, Zara took a deep breath and felt a small sense of relief. She had made it, but she knew that freedom wasn't just about escaping one nightmare. It was about finding something worth fighting for. Ahead of her, a group of people stood waiting. They were a mixture of men and women, dressed in practical clothing, their eyes wary but hopeful. They looked like they had been through a lot, but there was strength in their faces. These were survivors, just like her. One of the men stepped forward, his expression filled with both relief and curiosity. You heard our signal? He asked, his voice rough but grateful. Zara nodded, her throat tight. I did. I came to help. What's going on here? The man glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening, before answering. We're being hunted by the same enemies you've escaped from. They've taken over our planet, and we've been fighting to survive. But we're running out of time. We need help. We need someone who can fight back. Zara's heart clenched as she listened to his words. She understood all too well the feeling of being hunted, of being outnumbered by a stronger, more powerful enemy. She had been there. She had survived it. And now she had a chance to do more than just survive. She could help these people. She could fight back, just like the soldier had fought for her. I can help, Zara said, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions inside her. I've been through the worst, but I'm still standing, and I won't stop fighting. The man's eyes softened, and he gave her a grateful nod. We're lucky to have you. Zara felt a sense of purpose fill her chest. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about giving others a chance to live, to fight for their freedom, just as she had fought for hers. And as she looked at the people around her, she realized something. The soldier's sacrifice had not been in vain. He had given her the strength to carry on, to find a new purpose in this uncertain world. A new dawn was breaking, and for the first time in a long time, Zara felt hope. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape. She wasn't alone anymore. And this time, she would fight for a future of freedom, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed it.